Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Robin Reames, who is a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, professor of English at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and also the author of this book called The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, The Power of Rhetoric in Polarized Times. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you, Gregory. It's nice to be here.
Well, of course, we've got to start off by, I guess, defining rhetoric. I mean, you have a definition of it, which I think is a pretty good contemporary definition of what you're trying to do with the book. But I think a lot of people are confused when they hear rhetoric. Sometimes they think of it as the art of persuasion. Other times they think of it as the science of how words work. And so, I mean, should we be thinking about rhetoric as an art or as a science?
Well, it's a great question. Because I focus on the ancient Greek tradition, I would say the answer is yes. Because the term techne could cover both of those concepts that we have in English today. Art and science are kind of rolled together in that term, which is what Aristotle referred to rhetoric as originally in his definition, as a kind of techne, right, an art / science. And it's interesting actually that on the one hand, that's the number one question I get asked, and it's always a testimony to the way that rhetoric has been marginalized in recent decades in the academy. The fact that people don't seem to know what it is just is a testimony to the fact that people more or less stopped studying it. And so the book is really, in many ways, meant to be a kind of remedy to that problem, to get people to see the need to study it again. But at the same time, going all the way back to Aristotle, there's always been this need to sort of define rhetoric in a way that proves its utility, that proves its value against its detractors. I mean, when Aristotle offered his definition of rhetoric being the ability of seeing, the available means of persuasion, he was kind of defensively offering that against the views that Plato attributed to Socrates, right? That rhetoric is really just a way of misleading the soul by the means of words, right? And we still have that sense about rhetoric, that it's about deception or contorting the truth or manipulating audiences. But what is, I think, brilliant about Aristotle's definition and what makes it still relevant today, this ability of seeing the available means of persuasion, the term he's using there actually refers to this ability of seeing that kind of, we don't really have a term for it in English, but it really means being able to take a step back and appraise something from a distance in such a way that you take in the view of the whole thing, so you can see how things are, you can see how things could be, how they'd be different under a different set of circumstances. It's this really capacious term, theoria, like being able to see everything all at once. And so Aristotle saw rhetoric as precisely that, this ability to take a step back from language, to not be pulled around by it, not be immersed in it, but to understand it as if like from an overview or a distance. And he saw that as something that could apply to literally every field of study. I mean, he saw it as primarily having the most immediate application in politics, and there are lots of historical reasons for that and political reasons for that. But he also said that just like dialectic or just like philosophical disputation, it has a sort of application and utility in everywhere that language is used, which is everywhere in human activity. So that's the definition that I think has had the most capacious application over time, precisely because when we think of rhetoric only as the art of persuasion, then it has there's a real limitation to that, right? We're just learning to persuade without asking these larger questions about why are we persuading? Who are we persuading? Should we be persuading? What's the nature of the persuasion? Who's doing it to whom? And who's got the upper hand, right? Aristotle's idea of being able to take a step back takes all of that into account. And as I talk about in the book, the trouble with not studying it means we stop noticing all of those things. We stop asking questions about what's at stake for persuasive uses of language in politics, but in other realms as well today.
Yeah, I mean, I like this definition. It does seem to be sort of all about noticing, about bringing things to the surface, about understanding kind of what is happening to you, right, and what is happening to people around you. And I think you said that rhetoric was invented sort of as a response to these terrible events. It was kind of like a PTSD, where the ancient Greeks were like, "What the heck just happened to us?" Right, with these sophists. And so, I know some people that conflate rhetoric with sophistry, but rhetoric is really about trying to kind of understand, right, sophistry and its alternatives, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and there are lots of people going all the way back to the coining of both of those terms, sophist and rhetoric. Plato is largely responsible, at the very least, for coining the term for rhetoric. Going all the way back to Plato's depictions of Socrates' debates with the sophists, there's this conflation of the manipulation that was that the sophists were accused of carrying out in Athens. There's no actual direct proof of that ever having happened. What there is direct proof of was Athenians manipulating each other. But yeah, it's easy to blame. It's easy to blame the foreigner, right? And the sophists were none of the ones that Plato took issue with were native Athenians. But yeah, the conflation of those two ideas, the sophist who manipulates and the idea of rhetoric, goes all the way back to the very beginning of that term. And so I guess in some ways that kind of offers a rationale for why those sort of defensive definitions of rhetoric, that it's worth studying, that it's useful, that it's important to be able to take a step back from language, that it's important to be able to understand how persuasion is occurring. It's important for me to be able to understand why I tend to be persuaded of one thing more easily than another. All of those sort of defensive justifications for the existence of rhetoric in many ways are tied to that original conflation or collapse between the two ideas of the person who manipulates politics for their own gain, and the use of rhetoric and the skills of rhetoric.
Now, you talk about how there was a certain conception of truth that emerged at the same time as the discipline of rhetoric. And you contrast it with this older view of truth. And I think you're making the point that those two alternative views of truth, I mean, one didn't supplant the other. Right? They both continue to sort of exist side by side, even now in 2023. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that older form of truth. I mean, it's kind of astonishing to think that if the Super Bowl was to take place in ancient Greece, that the halftime show would be an orator, right, or a poet. That part, I think, has disappeared. We don't have that kind of power attached to the oral spoken word, but we do still value this notion of authenticity, right, and this belief that truth comes as a result of exposure or the revelation of what somebody is feeling, thinking, observing, and so forth, right? So could you talk about those two different forms of truth?
Yeah. And yeah, we don't get drunk on words in our culture in precisely the same way that the ancient Greeks did. I think our closest analog would be like a Beyonce concert, right? Like we're drunk on words. We just don't notice that what it is that's being conveyed to us in those moments. It's still words, right? It's still speech. It's still measured and rhythmic and crafted speech that's meant to excite the hearer. So yeah, it's shifted in venue and in genre.
The academic lecturers, maybe we wish that our students would get drunk on our words, but they're usually on their phones.
Well, yeah, I don't think we put the same amount of work into it either that maybe we should. But those two ideas of truth, I mean, really that's one example of what I'm trying to accomplish in the book as a whole, is to show how these lost ideas, which, as I say, we've neglected, and our muscles for studying them consequently have been atrophied. But buried inside of these texts from the rhetorical tradition that are, gathering dust on shelves, is just just some brilliant ideas that can help us understand why things are taking the course that they're taking in contemporary politics. One of which is this sort of very hard to account for phenomenon, especially in the Trump era, the Trump years, of a politician who tells lies. He says things that are factually untrue. And you don't have to be a critic of Trump. It's still conceivable that one would be a follower of Trump or a fan of Trump and acknowledge that, yeah, he doesn't tell the truth, right? There's a disconnection between his words and the reality his words are supposed to represent. When he says that he's won awards on the environment, that's just not true. It didn't happen, right? But at the same time, the weirdness of this phenomenon is that, on the contrary, his followers love him largely, and when you ask what they like about him, largely what the account they give refers to his truthfulness, his honesty. He tells it like it is, right? He's upfront. He doesn't lie like those other politicians, right? These are the kind of documented things that his supporters and his base will regularly say about him, and not just this year, but stemming all the way back to 2016 and before, even if you think about it. So what the rhetorical tradition recognized at the very beginnings, and by the beginning I mean like the 4th century, when it was first being formulated and the very first complete works on rhetoric were being written, was people were recognizing, because writing written speeches, preparing speeches ahead of time, was a relatively new technology at that moment. They were recognizing that there was a fundamental difference between the kind of truthfulness that a written speech could produce and the kind of truthfulness that an extemporaneous speech could produce. And that wasn't just a way of saying, well, they come off as more truthful or they come off as more authentic when they're speaking without the use of a script, without prefabricating their words. No, like this one text that nobody reads anymore by a dude named Alcidamas, it explained at length that it's not only that it seems truer, it's that it is truer. And the reason Alcidamas says that extemporaneous speaking is truer is because there's just no way that pre-prepared words can truthfully respond to the audience that's in front of the speaker. There's no way that a pre-prepared speech can truthfully reveal what that speaker's own thoughts, what the condition of their thinking is in the moment that they're speaking. And his point is that that's untrue. It's untrue to write something at a different time than the moment you're speaking. It's untrue to repeat words in a moment when those words came to you. So it's a little bit stronger than saying he comes off as real, he comes off as straightforward, he comes off as authentic, it comes off as though he's speaking from the heart. Alcidamas's point is like, no, truth is when you're speaking from the heart. Truth is when you're putting yourself on display. And so that chapter is trying to explain not only that these two concepts of truth are still in play, the one that was invented by Plato, where language represents and corresponds to the world, and it can only be true when it's an accurate correspondence, which, by the way, is a concept of truth that Plato invented precisely to be able to defeat the sophists, because he felt like they were able to kind of contort that relationship between language and the world. So it's not only to say that they both coexist side by side, but it's also to help the reader understand why we have these completely opposing points of view, or these completely opposing understandings about the same phenomenon. It actually can be explained by two different understandings of truth that are operating concurrently. So it's not quite fair to just say that people who believe Trump are stupid, right? Or that they're just dupes. I'm not defending his lies, but I am trying to enlarge our perspective on why we have these completely different perspectives, why people like family members of mine, or like people like my dad, who I talk about in the book, would have that response to Donald Trump. And it opens up some possibilities for creating more understanding. Maybe we could shift the conversation away from our disagreements about the person of Donald Trump and the truthfulness or lack thereof of his words, to why we're disagreeing about the nature of truth these days, why we don't share the same understanding about what truth itself means as such.
So it doesn't seem like that version of truth is limited to one side of the political spectrum. I mean, we see it across the spectrum, for instance, on the other side, we'll hear about one's lived reality as a source of authority, right? Is that a manifestation of the same view of what truth is?
Do you mean in the sense of speaking your truth, so to speak?
Yeah, yeah.
No, I don't think that is a manifestation of that same earlier. I don't think that's a manifestation of an ancient oral notion of truth. I think that's more of a manifestation of, contemporary critiques of a monolithic idea of truth in the present day, but not something that's kind of inherited from history that's still with us today. I think that would be more of an example of a way that a sort of hegemonic notion of truth inherited from the West, the same truth that we inherit from Plato, gets critiqued in the contemporary moment.
But I mean, I think we all have this idea that contemporary, spontaneous speaking has some special power. I remember when I first went to the MLA conference and I saw that everybody was reading their papers. I was like, what? I couldn't believe that people would get up there and read a paper. I was like, why do I even need to be here? Just, send it to me as an email attachment and I'll read it at home. And I remember when we recorded our online course here, we have an online course at Berkeley, the course designers insisted that I write out a script and that I read the script word for word. And I thought, this is really not going to be very compelling. People, unless you're a practiced actor, this is it's gonna miss. There's something missing there that the viewer is going to sense, and they're going to kind of tune out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the examples you give are great examples for capturing how we have this sort of unspoken preference for the feeling or the experience of something being delivered extemporaneously. And it's really only one step further to realize that we do associate that with a kind of truth telling, or we do associate that with having being a species of truth in one way or another. But yeah, absolutely. I think in the book, one of the things I offer is a sort of surprising chart, a surprising little data chart where if you kind of look down this list of politicians, if you think about like over the course of the last, say, 20 or so years, and you think about a list of prominent politicians who've risen to the national stage, we could instead of sorting them in terms of right and left, we could think about sorting them in terms of coming off as truthful as opposed to not. And it just so happens that if you do that little exercise for yourself, you realize, oh, the extemporaneity actually creates this sense of truth that I give myself over to with the politicians who are aligned with my side of the scale, right? But which I'm critical of when they're not. But it doesn't match up with the correspondence of their words to reality, right? Some of the politicians who are the most accurate about or their statements are the most true by correspondence, true by matching up with the world that they're supposed to represent, don't come off as truthful at all. But then you have some people who, like Ted Cruz, are like the worst of both worlds. They actually are very, very high on the lie scale and very, very low on the extemporaneity scale. They've got like neither form of truth.
Yeah, so it's no surprise then that he kind of flamed out then at the
right.
presidential level. Uh-huh.
Right, and
well,
and you, repeatedly so, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have a couple characters that you flesh out in the book, including Gorgias and Protagoras. And I think for most of us, our view of these folks comes from the Platonic dialogues. But these were significant characters, right, in ancient Greek history.
They were, and they're some of the most poorly understood and misunderstood, precisely because we've lost their works. And one of the reasons that we lost their works is their ideas were deemed like not worth saving over a long historical trajectory. And so it's no wonder then that towards the end of antiquity, writers were talking about how hard it was to find complete works by Protagoras. And fast forward just a couple hundred years from there, and they're gone entirely. But no, what's left of their words is fragments only, or what's left of their works is fragments only. And so we can only really sort of cobble together a sense of what their ideas were comprised of. And of course, a lot of that is taken from hostile testimony, Plato being the most notorious of it. Most of what we know of Protagoras and Gorgias, we get through Plato. And Plato does not have the nicest things to say about either one of them. I mean, he treats Protagoras with a certain amount of respect, but certainly not Gorgias. But when you look at the actual fragments and what their actual words were, where we have, like, by numerous sources, direct quotes from their texts, their thought worlds are fascinating. And one of the reasons that they're fascinating is that it provides us a window into the kinds of debates about language that people were able to have before that monolithic notion of truth took form, before Plato's what I've been referring to as this correspondence theory of truth, where language is strictly representational of the world. For example, Gorgias and Protagoras had two completely different takes on what kind of thing language was. Like, Protagoras really believed that language was a material thing, just like every other material thing. He was a strict materialist. And so he believed that language was subject to the flux and flow and decay and generation of materiality, just like everything else in the physical universe was. That language was subject to that as well. Gorgias had the opposite view. He thought that language is something else entirely. Language is not the things themselves, Gorgias said. So that would lead to these debates about what kind of truth could be reached, could be understood. Like, what kind of knowledge can we construct out of language if language, just like everything else, is material and changing and decaying and regenerating all the time? What kind of knowledge can we achieve by language if language is completely detached from the world, right? It leads both of them to epistemic quandary. And I mean, this, for many reasons, is why we see in Plato this attempt to suppress and silence ideas like those that come from Gorgias and Protagoras, because I mean, even a novice reader of Plato can see that's not the kind of thing Plato wants to open the door to, this idea of a profound epistemic uncertainty that leads to a lack of knowledge, or a suspension of judgment, or a refusal to grasp onto certainty. These are the kinds of things we see when we patch together some of those fragments of the sophists, that sadly, because those works are lost, we'll never be able to recreate the broken vase, completely, but we can only begin to speculate about how all those little broken bits of pottery were connected to one another.
Well, in your discussion of Protagoras, you emphasized the importance of metaphor and the importance of stories. And, at least in my teaching and my studying, that's what I've discovered. It took a while for me to figure it out, but people remember stories, and they understand things much better through stories than through logical explanation, right? You can get up on the board and start with your axioms and work your way through, and most of it just sort of washes over. But if you tell people stories, and those stories may not even be true, right? They might be stories that you kind of make up or exaggerate. That's really how people come to their aha moments. And I mean, Plato does this too, right? Everybody does it. I was thinking of Abraham Lincoln. You didn't mention him, but I mean, every time anybody would ask him a question, he would respond with an allegory, right, or a story. And I actually have a friend who decided to create his own Gen AI coach, and he said, "I want Abe Lincoln to be my coach." And so whenever he gets into a difficult problem, he consults with his virtual coach, and his virtual Abe Lincoln coach spins up a story. He said it works great.
That's great. Yeah. The stories like that. That's. I think Protagoras is probably the earliest writer where we have evidence that he knew the persuasive power of stories, and he especially used the persuasive power of stories in situations where there really was no definitive proof. So the example I give in the book is and the question of whether or not virtue is innate or whether it can be taught, right? If Plato believed, or has Socrates say that he believes that, you can only really have gain virtue by having a complete understanding of the good. It's not something that can be learned as a kind of skill. And Protagoras wants to make the opposite position, or he wants to establish the opposite position, that no, virtue could be taught like just alongside any skill, like carpentry, right? It could be taught in the same way you could become a virtuous citizen, in the same way that you could learn how to be a carpenter. How are you going to prove this, right? These are questions of human affairs that are inchoate and very difficult to prove, because it relies on human behavior. Human behavior is unpredictable. It's changeable, right? It's immersed in the social world. The social world is not a fixed thing. So this is one of the reasons that, again, going back to Aristotle, if we fast forward a little bit from Protagoras, why he said that rhetoric is useful, especially in those conditions where you can't offer a geometrical proof to a question of whether virtue can be taught. You really can only approximate it. Knowing that, Protagoras was an excellent storyteller. So he would in the ancient Greek tradition, like one of the best skills a person could have is if they had an ability to marshal and recontextualize myths that everybody knew, like stories from Hesiod, stories from Homer, right? If you could take a myth from a poet and recast it and work it to your own ends, well then, I mean, that would really get the crowd going. That's one of the reasons you see Plato do the same thing, right? Why he kind of cobbles together myths that take bits and pieces from elsewhere. And, the crowd would cheer because the story was so good, right? And did it prove the point? Not exactly, right? But it told a really memorable story, and it told a story in such a way that seemed to prove the point, right? It was as good as proven as far as the audience was concerned. And this is something it's a lesson that rhetoricians keep rediscovering over the years. So in that same chapter, I explained that, Kenneth Burke in the 20th century came to the same realization. He noticed that really anytime anybody's persuading anyone of anything, often stories are at play, and it seems like it's a report of the world. It seems like it's just telling you how it is, telling you what happened. But if you pay attention, it always has this dramatic structure. Kenneth Burke says there's always a main character, there's always a scene, there's always some purpose or some action, or the main character is always going to use some prop to carry out some purpose or some action. And you notice that what's happening in those stories, Kenneth Burke would say, is it's getting the audience to identify with that version of reality, right? So it's not language can never give you reality itself. It can only package it in a way that makes it recognizable to you. So I think that's why, as you mentioned, students will remember the stories, or they'll pay attention for the stories. It's concrete. They can imagine it. They can see it. It's tangible, right? So yeah, with Kenneth Burke, what he wanted people to notice was any time language is packaging reality in this way, it's not just giving you a reality, it's giving you a kind of screen on reality. What you're seeing is not the thing itself. You're seeing the kind of overlay, the dramatic screen that's placed on top of reality. And if you identify with it, well, that means you've been persuaded, right? If you identify yourself in that scene, or you identify with that main character, if you identify with that version of reality, well, then that's evidence that you've been persuaded. In that particular chapter, I show why that particular technique was so persuasive in the birther movement, right? There were two different versions of reality and two different versions of America. And one of them was sort of setting the scene in this this history of American patriotism and 20th century military history, and another, and saying, oh, Barack Obama doesn't belong in that scene, right? And another one was just talking about the reality of 21st century American life, and then also calling people who were birthers wingnuts and kooks, right? So they had become props in one story, whereas they're the main characters in another story. Well, which one do you think they're going to identify with, right? Are they going to identify with a story where they're being told they're a prop? Or do you think they're going to identify with a story where they're being told they're a hero? It's very obvious. Which one would you choose? I know which one I would choose, right?
Yeah, I remember when I was teaching a course on statistics, and I was explaining why you should trust data and not anecdotes, and people looked a little puzzled. So I told them a story about what goes wrong when you based on anecdotes, and everyone's like, oh, okay, that
So
makes
you used
sense.
an
And then
anecdote to prove.
yeah, so one
Very clever.
student raised his
Yeah.
hand and said, hey, that's an anecdote. And I said, yeah, all right,
Yeah.
wow, okay, that student gets an A, right, for seeing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, Kenneth Burke and Stephen Toulmin and Hannah Arendt, those folks that you cite as sort of the 20th century revivalists of rhetoric, they were also responding to something, right? World War II and the rise of the Nazis, and they were like, hey, how the heck did that happen? And I remember reading all three of those back when I was in graduate school, and I don't know whether anybody, I mean, I guess Hannah Arendt is still sort of read from time to time, but that whole movement, I mean, it seems to have kind of fizzled. I mean, is there a modern movement of rhetoric that is being widely read in the academy?
Not widely read, but not widely read. I mean, really, where those figures, with the exception of Hannah Arendt, where those figures are read is in this my discipline, this sort of like small, marginalized discipline in the academy. And yeah, I mean, in the same way that rhetoric was born when in the ancient Greek tradition, when people felt like they needed to understand how they had managed to make such horrendous political decisions, how had they been led to misapprehend reality so profoundly through the power of words. Rhetoric came into being as a science or an art, a science art, as a way of addressing that, and so that the same mistake wouldn't recur. In the 20th century, the exact same thing happened. There was just this almost spontaneous generation of all of these post-war 20th century thinkers recognizing that reason, dispute, debate, the arts of language, the arts of rhetoric might have averted the catastrophes of the 20th century had people been more critically aware of how language was functioning, had they been more critically aware of how, when they thought that they were seeing the thing itself, reality itself, they were really just responding to a compelling narrative, or they had been persuaded by a powerful metaphor and they just didn't recognize it because they're not studying language. They're thinking language is a clear glass on the world. And so in a similar way, I mean, I wanted to bring these together in the book in a similar way to say, it's not too late yet for us to learn from the past and to study the arts of language rather than what we're having a tendency to do in our own cultural political moment, public discourse, which is fail to notice how language is functioning, to give ourselves over to the strongest possible version of an opinion about something that's highly contingent and disputed, and where the language is not necessarily a direct representation of reality, and yet we assume that it is, in part because we agree with it, right? Or because it captures some pre-existing beliefs that we have. We might begin to study it now before we're led to make the same level or same magnitude of catastrophic political decisions.
Well, I mean, I think there are certainly people who are kind of wondering, well, how the heck did Brexit happen? How the heck did Trump happen, January 6th and so forth? Now, I don't think anyone would claim that those are at the same level of destruction or harm as what happened to the Athenians when they were defeated by Sparta, or what happened when Hitler took over. But certainly it seems to have created a bit of introspection on the part of people who oppose these things. I mean, is there sort of is this book part of a movement among thinkers and academics to try to figure out, like, well, why don't we understand this? Because simply talking about how terrible it is not enough, right? Understanding exactly what's driving these movements, why are they so popular, and why did they happen? I think they caught a lot of people off guard.
I don't know if there's a movement, Greg. That's a good question. I don't see one. I'm not trying to say that I'm like, a lone voice crying in the wilderness. I don't feel that way at all. But I think there's a general concern I hear echoed everywhere for the state of public discourse and the decay of public discourse and our inability to talk to one another, our complete inability to even interact with an idea that we find offensive or disagree with. But then at the same time, I hear the criticisms of like so-called both sidism, right? As I'm sure you've heard before as well, which is really just sort of another way of doubling down on this sort of intensified polarization. I think what I'm trying to do in the book, and I honestly, I can't say whether there's a movement for this or not. What I'm trying to do in the book is through highlighting language and highlighting the study of language and how language works. It gives us another alternative for thinking of ourselves primarily in terms of our political affiliation, or for thinking about arguments primarily in terms of a political affiliation, whether it's on the right or the left. I think it is possible through using a mechanism like rhetoric, which was designed to have like great utility in political discourse. It's possible to think about arguments as arguments and language as language, political arguments and political language as political arguments and political language, as opposed to thinking of them entirely in terms of whether they originate from the right or the left, whether I agree with them because I'm on the right or the left. Rhetorical thinking, as I lay out in the book, is about thinking in language in other terms, in the terms that are supplied by the rhetorical tradition. The way the rhetorical tradition developed over the course of its centuries long, its millennia long life, was by noticing and cataloging and naming the moves that happen in language. And so that's different from trying to decide whether I agree or I disagree. And it's different from trying to decide whether it's a correct position or an incorrect position, or a right position or a left position. It's noticing how the argument is functioning. And the aim of that is not always to decide whether I disagree or I agree. And one of the things I've been noticing in talking to people about this book is just how far gone we are with these kinds of techniques, because so the book really, it unearths these skills and techniques from history, but it also shows how you can use it in relatively recent examples. I tried to choose things that were like in most cases, like at least a decade old. So they're, they'd passed in a way, but they were relevant enough or recent enough for people to notice them. And in each chapter, I try to show how you can do this with a left-leaning argument or a right-leaning argument, and it changes your perspective. It's not, I believe it because it's one side or the other, but I understand where the disconnection is, or I understand where the misunderstanding is. And like one of the main responses I'm getting from people is, well, that's unfair because you're critiquing a right position and you're clearly a liberal, or that's unfair because you're just assuming that your point of view is correct, or that's unfair because you are a liberal, so how could you possibly understand? And the idea seems to be that like there's no room for analyzing an argument in terms other than its political orientation. And the whole point of the book is try to give these tools to show how, whether you're on the right or the left, you can break down an argument and understand it in completely new and different ways that is not guided by a political orientation. And it just seems to be something that's very hard for us today to even allow ourselves to do.
Well, I mean, when I look at most political discourse, I don't even think it merits the descriptor argument. I mean, it doesn't look like anybody's trying to persuade anybody. It looks more like people are trying to grandstand and, express their, identify themselves and express their loyalty. They're basically just making loyalty pledges rather than making any effort to persuade. I mean, at least that if you believe in revealed preferences, it doesn't even seem to be like they want to persuade. It's not even on their agenda, because if that was something they wanted to do, maybe they'd put a bit of effort into it. But it doesn't seem like that's what's going on here. And you of course offer a different, an alternative way of having a conversation, and you go back to Aspasia. Now, Aspasia is someone, hey, I think everybody needs to learn about her. She should be in the canon as well. I mean, we don't have any writing of hers, but she should be a hero and an inspiration, because I think what she's describing as conversation is what I've always thought of as conversation, which is forging agreement. And I guess the first step would be to abandon the war metaphors that we use when we talk about argument, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you've asked so many questions. I'm trying to think about how to approach it. The war metaphor for argument is not necessarily problematic if we're aware if we're aware of the way that it's guiding us, right? It's not necessarily, as soon as we become aware that the way that a metaphor is guiding the way that we think. So if we're thinking of argument as a war and therefore we have to stake our claim, we have to defeat our enemy, right? Well, then we're probably not going to have a very productive conversation. But if we're aware that the war metaphor is guiding us in that way, then we might approach an argument differently. But I think as a rhetorician, I would say even in those kinds of examples that you're mentioning where, people are spouting truisms or platitudes as a way of pledging allegiance to a political side, or what we call virtue signaling these days, right? Where it just doesn't even seem like it's an argument. What's the use of this, right? A rhetorician would say, no, there's an argument there, right? There's an argument there. It's an argument worth analyzing. It's an argument worth understanding. If only to understand what's happening in the world of political discourse and what's happening in the ways we're using language to disagree with one another, and why we're misunderstanding each other, why we don't hear each other. And I mean, the reason that a rhetorician would say, no, there's always an argument there, really comes from Stephen Toulmin, who you just mentioned, and that really when people make a position, they almost always say they're making an argument in favor of something, or they're making a kind of claim. They're saying something is the case about what is the case. And they usually marshal some evidence to support it. And that right there, just those two pieces, just the evidence and the claim, right there's a whole world of assumptions always hiding underneath the surface. So one of the things in the book I show is that even with those small little platitudes, those I pledge allegiance to my party statements, even there you can kind of unearth some hidden assumptions and understand that the surface level agreement is not always where the disagreement is happening. Oftentimes the disagreement is much deeper than that, and things get, for me, more interesting, but also sometimes more hopeful when I realize we could actually be talking about some of these deeper disagreements, and we're not. We haven't even started a conversation on those issues. But yeah, another technique is, and a way of understanding and unearthing some of those deeper, more subterranean disagreements is precisely as Aspasia taught, asking questions to find not just why we disagree, but where a potential point of convergence is. I mean, this is something that stems all the way back to the beginning of the rhetorical tradition, which you just mentioned, this need to establish agreement. Right? Aspasia used questions as a way of establishing agreement to figure out where two parties who disagree with one another, who are at odds with one another, maybe want the same thing, right? Maybe have a set of shared priorities, maybe have a set of shared values. But it was really Chaim Perlman and Lucy Ulbricht's Titeka that stated in the most emphatic and explicit way in reading the long rhetorical tradition from the beginning up until the 20th century, that said all rhetoric, all argumentation, all persuasion begins from a place of agreement. So that's one way to kind of tie all this together is to say, by analyzing the kinds of arguments that people are making, even when it doesn't seem like they're making an argument, by thinking a little bit more deeply about what's hiding under the surface of those arguments, by using those recognitions as a motivation for asking questions to unearth a deeper level of why we're disagreeing with one another, where we're misunderstanding one another. All of these ways are of establishing new agreements so that we can actually begin to do the productive work of coming to new agreements. So Aspasia, Cicero, Aristotle, Chaim Perlman, and Lucy Ulbricht's Titeka, everybody would agree. Everybody would say, we're never going to agree about everything, right? But we have to agree about some things. And even if the agreement is as meager as saying, we agree that this is important to be talking about, we agree that this is something that we all care about, right? That's a starting place. But we need new tools, not only to kind of figure out what some of those grounding as agreements might be, but we also need new tools to be critical of the things that we've come to be so strongly persuaded of. And if I could prioritize one aim of the book, it would be that one, right? We have too few tools at our disposal, at our fingertips these days to analyze and understand and really comprehend how our minds have been won, how our conviction has been won, why some language has been more persuasive than other language to us. Sorry, I went on for a really long time.
You said that if you no, you said that if you are educated in rhetoric, then you'll be a tough customer and you will be harder to persuade. But I think the problem isn't just that people are persuaded too easily, but I think people are also resistant to persuasion, right? So, if I think about Aspasia's methodology, let's find the common agreement, and then through questioning, let's try to expand the scope of agreement. This requires time, and it requires that you let down your guard. It requires some element of trust. I mean, when I try to use that methodology, people are like, wait, where are you going? Like, where is this heading? Like, why, what's your point? Like, they want to know they want you to throw your cards on the table up front so they can
like, are you going to try to get me to agree with something that I think is wrong?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the only way this method works, and it's, when you read Socrates' dialogues, there's like back and forth, that people actually respond to the questions. But I find that oftentimes people are just like, why? I'm not gonna do this. I know what you're doing. You're trying to persuade me of something, and I don't want to be persuaded, right? So,
I totally agree with you.
Delay conclusion until the end, but that's not something that people like to do.
No, but I think what I would say, again, like speaking as a rhetorician, what I see in that moment, and I have the same experience as you, so I don't disagree with anything that you're diagnosing. But what I see in those situations is somebody who's already been persuaded, right? They've already been persuaded of something so strongly. So maybe they don't want to be persuaded by something that would counter what's persuaded them, right? That's what I see in those moments. And one of the effects of studying rhetoric, is that you become a tougher customer, but not because there's something you're clinging to, not because there's some idea that you've decided is absolutely correct and fixed and immovable, but because you can see how the sausage is made in the language, right? You can see how the persuasion is attempting to gain your credence and your conviction, and it makes it harder for you to persuade. I mean, that was like the whole idea of creating an art where those techniques and moves are given names, and we can learn the names, and when we learn the names, we can identify when they happen in the language. Well, all of a sudden, it just demystifies it, right? I'm noticing that the language is making me feel angry, right? And rather than just assume that that's because the language is telling me something that's true in the world, I'm noticing, this is the language that made me feel angry. Why did that make me feel angry? What in the language provoked that response, right? What is this person trying to get me to do in response to my anger? What are they trying to marshal my anger to use as a sort of political or social response? Like, what kind of action is my anger supposed to be oriented towards? Those are the sorts of things that happen when you learn to identify the skills of rhetoric. And so that's a slightly different experience, and it's a slightly different phenomenon of this thing that I'm so convinced is true, and it feels dangerous when somebody tries to convince me otherwise. Instead, it's like that initial conviction is held with slightly looser hands. That initial conviction is much harder won in the first place. And it also can be unseated by new information and new persuasion a little bit more easily.
Well, I think you also emphasize the importance to get out of autopilot, right? And people use words and they don't really think about the impact that particular word choice might have on their way of thinking. I mean, I love the example of, time is money, right? You say, spend time, time is running out. And I there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if that's a view of time that makes sense to you, and it should make sense to most of us in the modern world, then it's perfectly fine to use it. But I think if you use it without knowing, you should see it and be like, oh, okay, that's cool. But that also means that if you are using words like pro-life or pro-choice, and you are pretending that those are objective descriptions of an argument rather than descriptions of an argument's conclusion, then you are sort of you're using language on autopilot, right? And I mean, I try to avoid using words that presume some kind of conclusion, like those, or progressive, right? I mean, where, hey, hold on a second. That assumes that anybody who's not progressive doesn't believe in progress, and we just sort of accept that word. I mean, do we need to be just more aware and conscious of the words that we use and how they influence how we think, and sort of voluntarily assent to the use of words? If we do so consciously and knowingly, and we agree with the implied argument that is baked into the words, then it's okay. But if we do it unconsciously, it's not okay.
I think the examples you're giving are good indicators of in many ways why we'll never be able to fully be off of autopilot. So the goal isn't to start using language differently so that every word and every sentence and every statement is deliberately chosen. I mean, the way that I'm speaking right now, like, this is a way we use language. The language comes, right? We are immersed in the symbolic network of language that's been accreting and that we've been gaining since before we can remember, right? That's what it is to be a language using human. And so we'll never get to that point where we're like, we can deliberately and knowingly and consciously determine everything about how we think, because we have taken our language in hand. We have taken our language in control. That's not the goal as I see it. The goal as I see it is to recognize what the effects are of certain kinds of language, and to use the tools of rhetoric that have been designed and honed and carefully tooled in order to make it possible for us to see how language works, those effects. So we'll never be able to use, I mean, to be a language user is in many ways to be on autopilot, but it is possible also as a rhetorical language user to be on autopilot, and also to recognize the effects of that, to see how the effects of that work their way into our way of seeing and viewing the world and understanding and responding to it. But yeah, the examples you give are good starters. Like, I mean, one of the things I hear when I hear that opposition of pro-choice, pro-life is like an opposition not just of political movements, but of values being highlighted in that rhetoric, right? The value of choice and the value of life. And as I discuss in the book, like, a lot of those disagreements happen when there's a kind of a sense or an assumption that those values are absolute and exclusive and can't be tempered by any other value. I mean, that's where you see the more pitted a debate is, the more intractable the one value that should be prioritized as an absolute value over every other value is, right? You can begin to see how that works in the language. You can begin to see how the language guides us to think that way. But it isn't as though the goal is to stop language from doing that. The goal is rather to be aware of when it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, I teach in a business school, and also I teach law from time to time. And those are disciplines where I think what we try to inculcate in students is that there are alternative perspectives to every problem, every issue, and the answer to every question, everyone jokes, is it depends, right? If somebody says it depends, it means that they've been to business school. And of course, the domain in which we do this is, business decisions, legal decisions, and so forth. But sometimes I think we secretly hope that it will kind of percolate out into other aspects of the ways that people think. But one thing I've noticed in my teaching is that the thing you're describing in the world of politics, right, which is these sort of face-offs without any possibility of real discussion, that way of thinking has filtered into non-political stuff. So I notice that sometimes my students have a difficult time engaging in arguments around things that have absolutely nothing to do with politics, because that way of thinking in politics has trickled down the idea that you start with your conclusion rather than working your way to it through some process. Should there be a rhetoric of every single department rather than having a rhetoric department? Should there'd be a rhetoric of academic discourse, a rhetoric of business, a rhetoric of law, a rhetoric of biology. Should everybody get some kind of rhetoric the way everybody gets some kind of statistics?
Yes. It's the short answer. Yeah, I mean, I would be all in favor of more rhetoric all the time. I mean, it's done, and historically it was in everything. I mean, the reason that Aristotle tooled it the way that he did was to say that, look, there are two arts of language, dialectic and rhetoric, that apply to every field of study. They're for slightly different uses, but you need them both, right? You need them both because with dialectic, there are things that can be proven, and you need dialectic to prove them. With rhetoric you need, because there are all kinds of things that we study that are really only probable. You need rhetoric to like approximate the best possible answer. And so for that reason, for all of the late ancient period, all of the medieval and the Renaissance period, the foundation for education was logic, grammar, and rhetoric. It was it was called the trivium. The foundation for every course of studies started there, and the whole idea was you need to understand how language works on a logical level, on a grammatical level, and on a persuasive level in order to be able to engage in any other field, whether your other field is mathematics, astronomy, geometry, whatever it is. You need to have this linguistic foundation. And so the idea would be, like, as you're saying, whatever specialization you go into, whatever more narrow and discrete field you go into, you have this foundation. So there's no way you're going to encounter an argument that you don't really understand the mechanics of, or there's no way you're going to encounter somebody trying to prove something that's unprovable, right? There's no way that you'd be like mystified by that, because you've got the foundation. That's precisely what was lost when rhetoric stopped being studied, and now grammar and logic are going through a similar kind of attrition as well. But yeah, the idea was essentially, as you put it, that foundation makes it possible to engage with, understand, comprehend, respond to, be critical of really any kind of argumentation in any field of study.
Yeah, we have communications classes in business schools, but I think they're mostly focused on what we call authentic communication, right? Which is certainly important, but it's only really a subset of the rhetorical tools that are available to you. Well, Robin, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great. The book is called The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, The Power of Rhetoric in Polarized Times. Thanks again.
Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.